The human research vessel moved slowly through the dark space, and its sensors were picking up strange readings from the planet below, and Dr. Maya Brooks stood at the observation deck watching the surface with wide eyes because violet forests stretched across continents that should not exist, according to every known law of planetary formation, and she felt her heart beating faster with excitement and fear, mixed together in equal parts ludent. Karen White called from her station that they were picking up energy signatures, and these readings were organized and deliberate, and this was not natural phenomenon, but something created by intelligent beings, and the crew gathered around the displays watching the patterns that danced across their screens like nothing they had ever seen before in all their years of space exploration. Captain Lisa Monroe made the decision that would change everything for humanity, and she ordered them to land on the surface, and some crew members looked worried. But nobody questioned her command because Lisa had led them safely through dangerous situations before, and they trusted her judgment even when it seemed risky. The shuttle descended through crimson clouds that swirled around them like living things. And the instruments showed readings that made no sense according to human science, and then they broke through the cloud layer, saw the planet's surface for the first time, and everyone stopped breathing for a moment because the sight was so beautiful. And so alien at the same time. The forests below were not green like Earth forests, but violet and silver, and they seemed to glow with their own internal light, and crystal formations rose from the ground like natural skyscrapers catching the light of the strange sun, and rivers of liquid that might not even be water wound through valleys that looked carved by artistic hands. Rather than natural erosion, the shuttle landed in a clearing that seemed almost prepared for them, and the ground was smooth crystal that reflected the sky above, and Maya was the first to step out onto the alien soil, and she felt the air on her face, and it was warm and smelled like flowers she had never encountered, and something else that reminded her of electricity. Before a storm, that was when they saw her standing at the edge of the crystalline clearing, and she was tall and impossibly graceful with silver hair that seemed to capture starlight itself even in the daylight, and her armor was crafted from materials that shimmered between metal and living tissue and changed colors as she moved, and her eyes were ancient and piercing, and they held the weight of centuries of memory and pain. Maya felt frozen in place, because this being was clearly not human, but she was also clearly intelligent and aware in her presence commanded respect and awe, and behind the silver-haired woman something massive began to move in the shadows of the violet forest. Wings unfurled, and they were not the wings of any creature from Earth's mythology, but something far more magnificent and terrifying, and the dragon emerged into the clearing, and it was vast beyond belief, and its scales shifted through colors that human language had no names for, and seemed to exist in more dimensions than the three humans were familiar with. The dragon eyes burned with an intelligence that made their advanced AI systems seem primitive and childlike, and Maya understood in that moment that humanity was not the pinnacle of creation that they had always assumed themselves to be, and there were beings in the universe who had been wise and powerful long before. Humans had even learned to make fire. Maya was the first human to step forward despite her fear, and she raised her hand in the universal gesture of peace that humans had used for thousands of years, and hoped that it would be understood across the vast gulf of species and culture and time. Elf woman tilted her head, studying them with an expression that mixed curiosity and something darker that looked like recognition and old anger, and she spoke, and impossibly the humans understood her words, even though she was clearly not speaking any Earth language, and the translation seemed to happen directly in their mind. She said that they were the scattered ones and the children of the forgotten war, and that they had finally found their way home after wandering lost for so long, and her voice carried both hope and accusation in equal measure. Before anyone could respond or ask what she meant by those strange words, the forest exploded with movement all around them, and thousands of armored figures emerged from behind the violet trees like ghosts materializing from thin air, and they all carried weapons that looked like technology blended with magic in ways that defied human comprehension. Dragon roared, and the sound was not just noise but seemed to shake reality itself, and Maya felt it in her bones and in her teeth and in the core of her being, and she understood that this creature could unmake them with a thought, if it chose to do so, if the humans were completely surrounded by warriors who moved with perfect coordination and deadly grace, and their weapons were raised and charging. With energy that made the air crackle and glow, and Maya counted at least 3,000 armed soldiers in the clearing, and probably more hidden in the forest. Beyond, Captain Lisa Monroe stepped forward to stand beside Maya, and she kept her hands visible and non-threatening, and her voice was calm despite the danger. They all faced, and she tried to project confidence and peaceful intentions through her. Oddly, Language Karen White moved to protect the captain, flanking her left side, and her hand rested near her sidearm, but she did not draw it because that would be suicide against these numbers and with these weapons, and she trusted Lisa to talk them out of this situation somehow. The silver-haired elf woman watched them with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall, and her hand rested on a blade that hummed with power and seemed eager to be released, and the dragon behind her gathered energy in its throat that glowed brighter and brighter with each passing second. Maya felt time slow down as she realized this was the moment that would determine whether humanity made peaceful contact with an alien species or whether they would all die. Here on this beautiful alien world so far from home and never be found by their people, the elf woman spoke again, and her words were cold and formal. She said that they were trespassing on sacred ground, and that their presence here violated ancient laws, and that they must surrender or be destroyed, and there would be no third option given to them. Lisa tried to explain that they came in peace, and that they were explorers seeking knowledge and friendship, and that they meant no harm to anyone, and that they did not know about any ancient laws or sacred ground. Because this was their first time in this region of space, the elf woman laughed, but it was a bitter sound without joy, and she said that ignorance was no excuse, and that humanity had a long history of convenient forgetting when it suited their purposes, and that she would not be fooled by their innocent act. Maya felt her hope sinking, because this mysterious being clearly had some grudge against humanity and believed they had done something terrible in the past, and there seemed to be no way to convince her otherwise, and the dragon was still gathering that terrible energy, and soon it would be too late. The other humans in the shuttle crew watched through the windows, afraid to come out, but ready to fight if necessary, and they prepared emergency protocols and sent distress signals back to the main ship in orbit. But help was hours away, and they would all be dead long before rescue could arrive. The elf warriors tightened their circle around the humans, and Maya could see their faces now, and they were beautiful and terrible and ancient, and they all looked at the humans with the same mixture of old anger and fresh suspicion. The dragon took one massive step forward, and the ground shook under its weight, and its head lowered toward the humans, and Maya could feel the heat radiating from its scales and smell something like ozone and burning metal and ancient magic all mixed together. This was how it would end, and Maya thought about all the things she would never discover, and all the questions she would never get to ask, and all the wonders of the universe she would never get to see, and she felt a deep sadness mixed with her fear. But the elf woman had not given the final order yet, and she stood there watching them with those ancient eyes, and Maya wondered what she was waiting for and what she was thinking, and whether there was any chance at all that they might survive this encounter. The moment stretched on, and nobody moved and nobody spoke, and the only sound was the humming of weapons and the low rumble of the dragon and the beating of human hearts that might stop beating very soon. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats, and in those 3 heartbeats Maya watched weapons charge that could unmake matter itself. And she saw the dragon throat glow with power that could vaporize their ship in orbit and turn them all to ash and twin stay. She knew they had only seconds left to live. Then Captain Lisa Monroe did something that every tactical manual said was insane, and she reached up and removed her helmet with slow, careful movements, and she exposed her face to the alien atmosphere. And to the weapons pointed at her head, Lisa said her name clearly, and her voice was steady despite the 1,000 ways she could die in the next second, and she said they came in peace, and that they came seeking understanding, and her eyes met the elf woman eyes without fear or aggression. The elf woman expression shifted, and something ancient and painful crossed her features like a shadow, and she took a step forward, and her entire clan tensed, ready to attack if their leader was threatened. And the dragon growled deep in its chest, and the sound resonated in their bones. The woman said the word understanding, as if it were foreign to her, and as if she had not heard it in a very long time. And she said that humans lost that privilege. 3,000 cycles ago, when they abandoned her people to the void, and left them to face the darkness alone, Maya moved quickly to stand beside her captain, and she said they did not know what the elf woman was talking about, and that their records went back only a few thousand years, and whatever happened in the ancient past, they were not there, and they were not responsible for those actions. The elf woman's eyes narrowed with suspicion, and she said it was convenient amnesia, and that humans always were masters of forgetting their crimes when it suited them and rewriting history to make themselves look innocent, and she had lived too long to fall for such tricks. She raised her hand, and energy crackled between her fingers like lightning, and it cast dancing shadows across the clearing, and she said they would not leave this world, and that their presence here violated the ancient accord, and they would pay for trespassing with their lives. The dragon stepped forward, and its massive head lowered toward the humans, and this was it, and this was how humanity greatest discovery would end in fire and forgotten history. And Maya felt her legs trembling, but she refused to run or beg. But then something unexpected happened that nobody could have predicted, and a child broke through the ranks of warriors, and she was small and perhaps no older than 7 by human standards, and she had the same silver hair and pointed ears as the adult elves. The child ran straight toward the humans with the fearless curiosity that only young ones possess, and she showed no fear at all of these strange beings from the sky, and her eyes were wide with wonder and excitement. The elf woman shouted a name that sounded like Alara, and her voice was filled with panic and command, but the child did not stop or even slow down, and she ran right up to Captain Monroe and stood there, looking up at the tall human with Massanash and Elar, asked if they were really from the skyships, and if they were the ones from Grandmother's stories, and her voice was high and sweet and filled with innocent curiosity that had no room for the hatred and suspicion of the adults. Around her, Lisa knelt slowly, making herself small and non-threatening, and she smiled. And it was a genuine smile that transcended species and culture, and she said yes, they came from very far away. And they traveled through the stars to reach this beautiful world. Lara reached out with her small hand and touched Lisa's face with gentle fingers, and she traced the unfamiliar features as if trying to memorize them, and she said that the human was warm and in the stories Grandmother told the sky people were always cold and made of metal and magic. Lisa reached up very slowly, telegraphing her movement so nobody would think she was attacking, and she gently placed her hand on the child's head, and it was a gesture of affection that humans had shared with their young since the dawn of time, and a blessing that meant protection and kindness. The effect was instantaneous and profound, and it rippled through the entire clearing like a wave, and the elf woman froze with her raised hand, trembling, and her eyes went wide with shock and recognition, and something that looked like pain around the clearing. Weapons slowly lowered, and warriors looked at each other with confusion and wonder, and the dragon threatening glow faded and was replaced by something else that could have been recognition or memory or both. The elf woman whispered something about that gesture and about the blessing of kinship, and her voice was breaking with emotion. She said they thought humanity had forgotten that sacred sign, and that it had been lost to time and ignorance. She dropped to one knee right there, in front of everyone, and like a wave spreading across water, her entire clan followed her lead, and thousands of warriors knelt and placed their weapons on the ground in a gesture of truce and surrender. The dragon lowered its massive head, and a rumbling emanated from its chest, and the sound was almost like a cat, but deeper and more musical, and it seemed pleased by what had happened. Lisa asked softly, still kneeling with the child, what the elf woman's name was, and she kept her voice gentle and non-threatening because she understood that something important just happened. Even if she did not fully understand what the woman said, her name was Serial, and tears were tracking down her face, and Maya realized this was the first time any human had seen an elf cry, and the tears looked like liquid silver in the strange light. Serial said she was guardian of the remnant and keeper of the old ways, and apparently a fool who almost destroyed their last hope for survival, and her voice was thick with regret and shame and relief all mixed together. She said she had waited 3,000 years for this moment, and that she had almost thrown it away because of old anger and pain and fear, and she asked them to forgive her. For the hostile welcome, Lisa stood and helped Surreal to her feet, and she said there was nothing to forgive, because fear was natural when meeting strangers, and that they should have announced themselves better before landing, and that both sides made mistakes. Maya watched this exchange with her scientist mind racing, because clearly there was a deep history here that humanity had completely forgotten, and these elves remembered everything and the gap between. Their knowledge was enormous. Ariel gestured to the dragon and said his name translated roughly as Ember of Ancient Skies, but they could call him Ember for simplicity, and the dragon made a sound that might have been agreement or amusement. Karen White asked the question that everyone was thinking, and she asked why a simple gesture of touching a child's head had caused such a dramatic change in the situation. Ariel explained that in the old days when their peoples were united, that gesture was sacred, and it meant that the person making it recognized the child as kin and worthy of protection, and it was a sign that could not be faked because it came from the heart. She said that her people had taught that gesture to humanity long ago when they first met, and it became a bond between their species and a sign of the alliance, and when Lisa made that gesture without knowing its significance, it proved that some memory remained deep in human instincts. Alara was still holding Lisa's hand, and she asked if the humans would stay and play with her and teach her about the sky ships, and her innocent question broke the tension that still lingered in the air. Sariel smiled through her tears, and she said yes. The humans would stay, and there was much to discuss and much to remember, and perhaps together they could heal old wounds and face new challenges. The warriors began to stand and put away their weapons, and they looked at the humans with new eyes filled with curiosity instead of hostility, and some even smiled tentatively. Maya felt relief wash over her so strongly that her knees almost buckled, because they had been seconds from death, and now they were guests instead of enemies, and all because of one simple human gesture of kindness toward a child. And board the dragon made a sound like wind through caves, and Sariel translated that he said humans smelled interesting and that he wanted to know if they tasted good. And then she laughed, said he was joking, and that dragons had a strange sense of humor. Lisa laughed too, and the sound seemed to ease the last of the tension, and she said they probably did not taste very good, but they were happy to share their food supplies. Instead, Suriel said they should go to the Hall of Echoes, where they could talk properly, and where she could show them the history they had forgotten and help them understand why their arrival was both a blessing and a terrible danger. Maya asked what kind of danger, and Sariel expression became grave, and she said that the enemy that drove their peoples apart was stirring again, and that they had very little time to prepare them. Humans looked at each other with concern, because they had come seeking knowledge and friendship, and instead they had found themselves in the middle of an ancient war they knew nothing about, but they had also found family and allies, and beings who remembered when humanity was part of something greater, and that was worth any danger they might face. They gathered in what Sariel called the Hall of Echoes, and it was a structure that seemed to grow from the planet itself rather than being built by hands, in the walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that Maya recognized with shock as data storage. It was organic quantum computing on a scale that Earth's best scientists had only theorized about and had never come close to achieving. And Maya felt her hands trembling with excitement at seeing such technology in person. The dragon Ember coiled around a central pillar, and his presence was both terrifying and oddly comforting, like a guardian watching over them, and his eyes reflected the dancing lights on the wall. Soriel stood before a wall that began to glow at her touch, and colors swirled across its surface, forming shapes and images, and she said they needed to understand the truth before they could understand the danger they all faced. She said that human history only went back a few thousand years because it was taken from them, and not by the elves, but by their own human ancestors, who could not bear the weight of what they had done and chose to forget rather than remember. The wall erupted with images that moved and seemed almost alive, and they showed humans and Elves side by side building wonders among the stars, and two species so different yet complementary, creating a civilization that spanned entire galaxies. Maya watched with her mouth open because the images showed cities that floated in space without any visible support, and ships that moved between stars in the blink of an eye, and technologies that made current human science look like children playing with sticks. Serial voice was heavy with loss as she said they called it the Unity, and for 10,000 years they built together, and humans brought innovation and ambition and the drive to push boundaries, while elves brought longevity and connection to the living universe and the wisdom of patience. Lisa asked what happened to end such a golden age and why it was forgotten, and Sariel's face became dark with remembered pain. The images shifted and showed darkness spreading across the stars like ink in water, and something vast and terrible emerged from between galaxies, and these were entities that existed in dimensions human and elf minds could barely perceive. Asariel said they were called the Void Choir, and they were beings of pure entropy who consumed not just matter but possibility itself, and every world they touched became sterile and dead, not just in body but in potential and hope and future. Anne asked how anyone could fight such beings, and Sariel's bitter laugh echoed in the Halsha, said they did not fight them, and that they ran, and in their running they shattered the unity and broke the greatest civilization the universe had ever seen, and scattered its pieces across the cosmos. Images showed the terrible choice that was made in desperation, and a plan to split the human and elf populations, and to scatter them across the universe on ships that would erase their passengers' memories and hide them in the vast emptiness where the Void Choir could not sense their presence. Sariel whispered that it was supposed to be temporary and just a few centuries of silence, and then they would reunite and rebuild, but the choir assault was more devastating than anyone imagined. Communications network collapsed, and the beacon worlds fell silent, one by one, and slowly across thousands of years, everyone simply forgot why they were scattered and where they came from and who they had left behind. Maya said quietly that it meant the elves remembered, and Sariel turned to face them. She said that the remnant remembered, and they were the ones who chose to stay behind and guard the core worlds and hope that one day someone would find their way back home, guided by instinct or fate or pure Chanchi, gestured to Ember and said the dragons remembered everything because they're kind. It has perfect memory, and they pass down every sight and sound and feeling through their bloodline, and nothing is ever truly lost to them. Suddenly Maya felt a presence in her mind, and it was not invasive, but offering, and images flooded her consciousness that were not her own memories. She saw Earth in its infancy as a blue-green jewel, and ships bearing the human genetic code, carefully seeding the planet, and guardians watching from the shadows as their sleeping children grew and evolved and forgot their origins. She saw elves weeping as they sent away half their population, knowing they might never see them again, and dragons carrying messages between dying worlds until there were no more worlds to carry messages. Too, she saw Sariel as a young warrior being given her duty to wait and watch and keep the flame of hope alive, no matter how many centuries passed and no matter how much it hurt to be alone. When the vision ended, Maya was crying, and she understood now the depth of sacrifice that Sariel and her people had made, and the loneliness of keeping vigil for 3,000 years. Sariel said they had been alone for so long, watching the stars and hoping, and when the human ship appeared, she thought, were the choir wearing familiar faces to mock her, and that was why she almost attacked. Lisa stood and walked to Sariel, and she said humans were not the enemy, and that they were family coming home after a very long journey, and that they should have been together all along. Sariel pulled up new images, and they showed the Void Choir moving through far galaxies, and she said they were awakening once more after sleeping for millennia, and this time they were learning and adapting. She said the silence that saved both species before would not work again because the choir had figured out how to track the scattered populations, and they were coming for everyone. The implications hit the humans like a physical blow, and they realized they had come seeking wonders and found a war that spanned the history of both their species. Lisa's voice was firm as she said they would fight together like they should have from the beginning, and that running away was not the human way when their family needed them. Serial looked at her with hope and doubt warring in her expression, and she said, humans numbered in the billions now spread across 100 worlds, while elves numbered only in the millions clinging to a handful of star systems. She said the dragons were even fewer, and Ember was one of only 52 that remained, and she asked how such small numbers could stand against an enemy that had devoured entire galaxies. Maya stepped forward with a fierce grin, and she said humans were very good at one thing, and that was being too stubborn to know when they were beaten, and apparently they learned that from someone. She gestured to Serial and her warriors, and said they had been holding the line for 3,000 years alone and outnumbered, and it was time humans returned the favor and showed what they could do. Corinne added that humans had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and extinction events, and they did it by working together and adapting and never giving up, no matter how bad things. Look at Cyril's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of relief and hope, and she said she had dreamed of this moment for so long but never truly believed it would come. She said that together they might actually have a chance, and that the combined knowledge and strength of both species could create something the Void Choir had never faced before. Ember made a sound that was approving, and Serial translated that he said humans had fire in their spirits and that dragons respected fire above all things. Little Alara, who had been watching quietly, spoke up and asked if this meant the humans would teach her to fly in their sky ships, and Lisa laughed and promised they would. Maya looked around at the Hall of Echoes and at the elves gathered there and at the dragon watching over them all, and she felt something shift in her understanding of the universe. They were not alone, and they never had been, and somewhere deep in human genetic memory was the knowledge of this alliance waiting to be awakened. The war was coming, and it would be terrible, but for the first time in 3,000 years, neither species would face it. Alonisariel raised her hand, and energy flowed from her fingers into the walls, and new images appeared showing both human and elf worlds scattered across the galaxy. She said they needed to warn everyone and gather their forces and prepare for the battle that would determine whether intelligent life survived in this part of the universe. Lisa nodded and said they had communication systems that could reach every human world within days, and that she would send out the call for unity and hope that people would answer. Maya added that human scientists would want to study everything that elves knew and share everything humans had learned, and that the combination would push both species forward by centuries. Said the military forces would need to train together and learn each other's strengths and weaknesses and develop new tactics that used the best of both species. The planning began, and hope kindled in hearts that had been dark for far too long. The next weeks were a frenzy of activity that neither species had experienced since the ancient days, and human ships began arriving in waves drawn by the greatest discovery in human history that they were not alone and never had been. Scientists and engineers and diplomats came from every human world, eager to learn and share and rebuild what had been lost, and the elves welcomed them with open arms and tears of joy. Maya found herself working alongside an elf named Claire in one of the bioforge chambers, and the technology was staggering because the elves grew their tools and ships the way humans built them, except the creations were alive and responsive. Maya watched in amazement as a weapon system literally blossomed from a seed matrix and unfolded like a flower made of metal and crystal and living tissue, all woven together in perfect harmony. She said it was incredible, and that humans had been using dead matter for everything when they could have been partnering with life itself, and her mind was racing with possibilities. Claire was younger than Serial by several centuries, and her enthusiasm for the reunification was infectious, and she said human quantum computing was equally amazing to elves. She explained that elves tried to convince the universe to cooperate and coax it gently into doing what they needed, while humans just made the universe obey through force of will and brilliant engineering. Maya laughed and said humans were good at that, for better or worse, and that sometimes the direct approach was the only approach that worked fast enough. Though fusion of technologies was yielding results faster than anyone had predicted, in human AI merged with elvish bio networks created intelligence matrices that could predict enemy movements across dimensional boundaries. Human weapons powered by elvish energy sources could strike at the void, acquire exotic matter in ways that neither species could achieve alone, and every day brought new breakthroughs. The greatest breakthrough came from an unexpected source, and that was the dragons themselves. Ember had taken to spending time with the human pilots, drawn by their fearless curiosity and their desire to fly faster and higher than anyone thought. Possible Commander Beth Taylor was Lisa's second in command, and she asked if she could try interfacing with a dragon, and Siriel had been skeptical at first. She explained that the bond between dragon and rider took years to forge, and it required a depth of mental discipline that even elves trained for decades to achieve. She stopped talking when Ember lowered his massive head to Beth and made a rumbling sound that could only be described as amusement, and the dragon eyes met the human eyes. And something clicked. Beth gasped as her consciousness expanded suddenly and touched something vast and ancient and utterly alien, yet somehow familiar, like meeting a part of herself she never knew existed. She could feel the air currents across Ember wings and the power coiled in muscles that could propel them between worlds, and the countless memories of a species that had witnessed the birth of stars. Beth whispered that she could fly, and tears were streaming down her face, and she said she could really truly fly, and her voice was filled with wonder. Sariel stared in shock, because what she was seeing was impossible, and bonds did not form that quickly even with the most talented elf riders, and this human had done it in seconds. Ember mental voice touched all their minds, and he sounded amused and ancient as he said that. Perhaps dragons knew the truth all along, and these were not strangers, but their riders returned from a long journey. Within days, 30 human pilots had bonded with dragons, and the effect on the remnant capabilities was dramatic, because suddenly their most powerful weapons had operators with human reflexes and creativity. Combined with elvish patience and dragon memory, the bonded pairs moved through the sky like poetry made flesh, and they could predict each other's thoughts and feelings before they were even fully formed, and the connection between them grew stronger with every flight. But it was the children who truly brought the species together, in ways the adults had not anticipated. Little Alara had appointed herself ambassador to the humans, and she followed Maya everywhere, asking endless questions about Earth and space travel and what humans ate and how they lived. She taught Maya Elvish songs that had not been sung in millennia, and showed her how to make plants grow with just a touch and a whisper, and Maya taught Alara about stars and planets and the scientific method. Human children arrived with their families, and they were fascinated by the elf youngsters, who could speak to animals with their minds and create light from their hands and move with grace that seemed impossible. The children played together without the weight of history or suspicion that burdened the adults, and they created friendships that would last lifetimes and bridge the gap between species. Maya said one evening, while watching human and elf children playing with a young dragon in the courtyard, that they were different but they fit together like puzzle pieces that were always meant to connect. Sariel stood beside her, and a rare smile crossed her ancient face, and she said, the unity was never just a political alliance, but something deeper, and it was a completion of what each species lacked. Alone, the moment of peace was shattered by alarms that screamed across every channel, and Karen's voice crackled over the communications system, urgent and afraid. Said they had contact, and multiple Void Choir signatures were emerging from dimensional space, and they were heading straight for them, and they had very little time to prepare. The war that Steriel had warned about was no longer a distant threat, but an immediate reality, and everyone online and human ships moved into formation alongside elf vessels, and the dragons took to the sky with their human riders ready to face an enemy that neither species had fought in 3,000 years. Surreal armor materialized around her, and it was alive and shifting and ready for battle, and she looked at Lisa with determination burning in her ancient eyes. She said this was what they had prepared for, and that together they would show the Void Choir that the unity was reborn and stronger than it had ever been. Lisa nodded and gave orders to all human forces, and she said they would protect this world and these people, and they would not let the choir take anything else from them. Maya found herself at a command station coordinating between human and elf systems, and her hands moved across the controls, With practiced efficiency, even though the technology was still partially unfamiliar, Claire worked beside her, linking their networks together and creating a seamless flow of information between all forces and the bio-network, responded to their combined commands faster than either species could achieve. Alan Alara and the other children were being evacuated to underground shelters, and the little girl looked back at Maya with trust in her eyes, and Maya promised silently that she would see her again when this was over. Enemy signatures grew closer, and the very air seemed to vibrate with wrong energy as the Void Choir began to tear through dimensional barriers. And Beth flew overhead, and their bond was like a beacon of light and determination, and behind them 29 other Dragon Rider pairs moved in perfect formation. Sorel raised her blade, and it sang with power, and she looked at her warriors who had waited 3,000 years for this moment, and they were ready. Lisa stood on the command deck of her ship, and she opened a channel to all human and elf forces, and she said they were not fighting for territory or resources, but for the right of all life to exist and flourish. She said they were fighting for the children who played together without prejudice, and for the future they all deserved, and for the unity that should never have been broken. The first Void Choir entities emerged from the tears in space, and they were exactly as horrible as the ancient records described, and worse, because seeing them in person was nothing like reading about them. But the humans and elves stood together, and they did not run, and they did not break, and the battle that would determine the fate of both species began. They called it the Battle of Remembrance, though in truth, it was a running fight across 3 star systems that lasted for 72 hours of continuous combat without rest or relief. The Void Choir came as they always had, as wounds in reality itself, tearing through dimensional barriers with appendages that existed in too many directions at once, and where they touched matter, it simply ceased to exist. Commander Beth Taylor shouted into her communications link, telling her squadron to use evasive pattern Delta, and her consciousness was merged with Ember as they dove through impossible angles that normal pilots could never navigate around her. 50 Dragon Riders moved in perfect coordination, and human instinct, combined with dragon power, created something the Void Choir had never encountered before, and did not know how to counter the new weapons that combined human ingenuity with elvish life force found their marks, and Void Choir entities screamed in frequencies that shattered dimensional walls. But for the first time in recorded history, they were actually bleeding and dying on the ground. Captain Lisa Monroe coordinated the defense alongside Sariel, and the elf warrior moved like a song made flesh, in her blade cut through choir incursions with precision born of 3,000 years of lonely practice. But now she was not alone, and human marines enhanced with elvish technology fought beside elf warriors equipped with human tactical systems, and what had once been 2 separate peoples now moved as one organism. They covered each other's weaknesses and amplified each other's strengths, and the choir forces that had swept through galaxies unopposed found themselves facing organized resistance for the first time. Karen White voice cut through the chaos of battle, saying that Sector 7 was failing, and the choir was pushing through the dimensional barriers, and if they established a foothold, everything would be. Starl turned to Lisa, and her voice was steel as she said, stopping them required the old way, and something called the sacrifice protocol, and Lisa understood immediately what that meant. Lisa asked, how many would be needed? And Sariel said 1 rider, and 1 dragon, and 1 guardian to guide them, and her eyes made it clear she intended to be that guardian. Lisa grabbed her arm and said they did not find each other after 3,000 years just to lose Sariel in the first battle, and there had to be another way. Sariel demanded to know what Lisa suggested, because the protocol required someone who remembered the old unity and who could anchor the dimensional collapse, and she was the last of her kind. Maya voice came through the communication channel, and she said Sariel was not the last anymore, and that she had been studying the ancient records, and the protocol did not require someone who lived through the unity. Maya explained it required someone who embodied it, and who carried the spirit of cooperation and trust between the species, and that changed everything. Understanding dawned on Lisa's face, and she looked up at Beth flying overhead with Ember, and she said, a human pilot and an elf guardian and a dragon who remembered everything, and that was The Unity Reborn Beth's voice cut in saying she and Ember volunteered, and that they were ready to do what was necessary, but that Sariel needed to stay, because she was too important to lose, as the keeper of memory little Alara pushed through the chaos. With Claire close behind trying to catch her, and the child said she would go with them as the guardian Sariel said absolutely not, with all the force of 3,000 years of protective instinct, and there was no way she would send a child into that kind of danger. But Alara said with simple wisdom that grandmother told her guardians did not have to be old, and they just had to remember what mattered most. She said she remembered Sariel teaching her the songs of unity, and she remembered the human captain touching her head with kindness, and that was what mattered more than anything. Elsa Sariel looked torn between duty and love, and Lisa knelt beside the child and said, Ilara was right, and the unity was not about the past, but about what they built together now. She said it was about old and young and human and elf and dragon and rider, all working together, and that was the only way they would survive. The decision was made despite Sariel protests, and Beth and Ember and Alara prepared for the protocol as Maya fed them the ancient calculations through their communication links. They would collapse the dimensional incursion from the inside and trap the Void Choir advance force in a pocket of severed reality, where they could never escape or threaten anyone again. The cost would be high, and they might not survive the energy feedback, but it was the only way to save everyone else's. They prepared to launch. Alara looked back at Sariel and said to tell grandmother stories to the human children so that someone would remember and carry on the traditions. Then they were gone, diving into the wound in space, where the Void Choir poured through like a river of darkness and entropy and death. What happened next would be debated by scientists and mystics for generations, and those present saw a light that should not exist in normal space. It was gold and silver intertwined with dragon fire, and it pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat, and they heard singing that was 3 voices perfectly harmonized. There was human determination that never knew when to quit, and elf grace that had weathered millennia of loneliness, and dragon memory that held the truth of what they all once were. The dimensional incursion collapsed with a sound like reality screaming in the Void Choir. Entities trapped inside found themselves sealed away forever in a prison of their own making. Explosion of energy was visible from orbit, and for a moment everyone thought that 3 heroes were lost, and Sariel fell to her knees with a cry of grief. But against all odds, 3 figures emerged from the closing wound, battered and burned, but alive and dumped. Beth was unconscious, but breathing, and Ember scales were dimmed, but his eyes were bright, and Alara was changed somehow, older and younger at once, and marked by the experience of touching the spaces between universes, but unbroken and still smiling. Choir retreated, and their forces pulled back through dimensional rifts, and fled to the dark spaces between galaxies, and they had been hurt, truly hurt, for the first time in their existence. Message was clear to any who could read it, and humanity and the remnant were no longer prey but predators in their own right. And the hunted had become hunters. 3 weeks later, Maya stood in the Hall of Echoes as representatives from 100 human worlds gathered alongside the remnant clans, and the wall of memory showed not just the past, but the future. Captain Lisa Monroe addressed the assembly, and she said they nearly lost everything because they forgot who they were, and 2 species that were stronger together had been torn apart by fear. She said they spent 3,000 years alone when they should have been united, and that was a mistake they would never make again. Sariel stepped forward with Alara at her side, and the child bore a new title as Guardian of the New Dawn, and she looked older now, in ways that had nothing to do with physical age. Sariel said the Void Choir would return because they always did, but when they came, they would not find scattered refugees, but the unity reborn and remembering its strength. Beth spoke next, with Ember massive head resting beside her on the stage, and she said human innovation and elf wisdom and dragon memory were not just 3 species, but 3 parts of a whole. She said they were only beginning to understand what they could accomplish together, and that the future was brighter than any past they had known. Little Alara, who had touched the spaces between universes and returned with knowledge beyond her years, had the last word. She said her grandmother told her the unity ended, but endings and beginnings were just human words for the same thing. And what mattered was that the story continued. She said this time they would write it together, and nobody would be left behind or forgotten, and the next chapter would be written by all of them. Assembly erupted in cheers and human voices mixed, with elvish harmonics and dragon roars created a sound that had not been heard in 3,000 years. Maya caught Seriali across the hall, and the ancient warrior smiled, and for the first time in millennia, the weight of lonely vigil lifted. From her shoulders, they had come home in both species, finding each other across the vast dark, and this time they would never forget what they meant to each other. War against the Void Choir would be long, and there would be losses and setbacks, and moments of despair, but they would face it together. Humanity had learned something essential that changed everything, and they were never meant to face the universe alone. The gentle touch of kinship on a child's head had opened the door, and now it was up to them to walk through it together into whatever future awaited them. Story of separation had ended after 3,000 years of pain and loneliness. The story of unity had just begun, and it would be written by human hands and elf hearts and dragon wings, and this time nothing in the universe would tear them apart again.